My name is Evelyn, and some of you may think I'm extremely fortunate, like the luckiest person on the planet. Why? This is going to surprise you. However, I won approximately $200 million in the lotto. Isn't that insane? What's even more bizarre? That was the worst day of my life when I won the money. Yes, you heard correctly. It was the worst day of my life because my life became miserable the moment I won that money. I used to live in a neighborhood with my mother, sister, and stepfather. I can't say everything was perfect, but I used to be content. The day I found out my stepfather had been sacked changed everything. And before we knew it, we were getting last-minute bill reminders and even a letter of warning from our landlord. We were evicted and kicked out of our own house on the third rent due notice. I wanted to cry that day, but I tried not to for the sake of my family. I told them that I could have just enough money for us to get by and that they shouldn't be concerned. I then withdrew all of my savings from my bank account, and I realized it could probably buy us an old caravan in which to live. That is exactly what occurred. My stepfather thanked me and went off to find a suitable caravan in which we could all fit. We were living in a caravan park near an old dump in a matter of hours. And then the tuition money I had been saving for months for college vanished overnight, forcing me to start from scratch. It was an awful feeling, and it appeared that I would never be able to attend college. My tears began to fall down my cheeks, but I didn't want anyone in my family to see me crying. So I hastily wiped them away. I excused myself and went for a walk outside the caravan. The longer I walked, the more I thought about my concerns. There was simply no way out of it. I happened upon a petrol station while strolling the streets. I needed to go to the supermarket to purchase something to drink, and I saw a giant sign that proclaimed, "Win up to $200 million. Sarcastically, I laughed. Sure, I muttered to myself. An elderly lady stood behind me and heard what I was saying. "You never know, sweetie," she said. "Life is entirely dependent on chance. You should get yourself one." I didn't trust her, but I was desperate. I requested 2 tickets from the cashier. He presented them to me, and I took one, then gave the other to the elderly lady as a kind gesture. We left the store together, and she gave me her card, saying she didn't have a TV and wouldn't know if she won. So she gave me her address and stated that if she won anything, I could come over to her house and inform her. As I walked back home, my mind raced with ideas about what might happen if I truly won any kind of money. It was a small fantasy, something to ponder about to take my mind off my problems. When I arrived home and opened the door, my sister, mother, and stepfather were all arguing. They appeared to have gotten into another money-related quarrel, but I was too weary to get involved, so I just went to bed. After a few days, I had almost forgotten about the lottery tickets, until one evening when my stepfather was watching TV and prompted me to check my figures. A local news outlet reported that the lottery money has not been claimed yet. They displayed the numbers on the screen and I took my ticket. I wasn't surprised that the numbers didn't match, so I crumbled it up and moved on, until I remembered the old lady's ticket and took it out with me. When I went over the figures again and again, the roux began to swirl in my head. The numbers were exactly the same. I hurriedly dug back into my pocket and pulled out the paper on which the lady had written her address. I wanted to run over to her and break the news to her, but I froze as I had the document in my hand. A total of $200 million. My mind kept returning to the thought. I gazed at the caravan, thinking about all the things we could do with that money. My family was in financial distress when I purchased the trip. I knew we could put the money to better use than she could. As a result, I chose not to tell her. What would she do with it anyway? She was an old lady. Instead, I jumped out of my chair and summoned my family. Nobody believed me when I told them the news, so I just smiled. We returned our attention to the television and double-checked the numbers. When it was confirmed, joy filled the room and we all jumped and shouted. It was an incredible sensation. Everyone began discussing their plans, but one thing we could all agree on was getting out of that caravan. We went to cash the ticket. My mother dressed up to look her best for a camera-filled news conference. Our first purchase was a large house in the best neighborhood in town. I gave the money to my mother, sister, and stepfather, and they were quick to spend it. My mother only shopped at the most costly stores and boutiques, whereas my sister purchased the car of her dreams. Even my stepfather began to waste money on frivolous purchases. Don't get me wrong, I didn't mind the initial rush, but things began to spiral out of control after a while. As money was spent, everyone's desire for more and more items grew. Items purchased, used once, and never touched again were filling our once too large house. I was relieved that everyone was having fun after all of our struggles, yet we all began to drift apart. It was as if we were at a fork in the road, each heading in our own direction, and although everyone else appeared content to stroll off towards their own concept of luxury, I was unhappy. Nothing I bought seemed to make me feel better, and the more I tried to get our family to spend time together, the further apart they became. Whenever we were in the same room, a fight would eventually break out. I seldom ever saw any of them. I just wanted to relive the closeness we previously shared. That's when I received the biggest surprise of my life. After a few months, my biological father arrived at the residence. I hadn't seen him in so long that I couldn't place him. He looked pleased to see me and mentioned missing his family. He went beyond that and began talking about how he wanted to be in my life again. I was furious when I noticed his expression. I recall the day he abandoned us, leaving me, my sister, and our mother to suffer alone because, quote, I didn't sign up for this. I never wanted children. I informed him that if he didn't want us, he wouldn't be in my life now, and he slammed the door in his face. I felt an emptiness fill me for the remainder of the day. It wasn't just because I saw my biological father, but also because of the money and what it transformed everyone into. A once close family was no longer speaking to one another. My sister and I used to be best friends, but now I only see her when she comes by to pick up her belongings or to request more money. My stepfather isn't the same hard worker he always was. He now spends his time on the couch, isolated from everything but the television. And while my mother was never the kindest or most caring person, she is now far worse. She makes no attempt to conceal the fact that she is only interested in the family for as long as it benefits her. She spent more money than everyone else and has grown spoiled. Unfortunately, I am no better. I always imagined myself to be better than my mother. But when the money arrived, I realized how similar we were. I began to become more materialistic. I started buying stuff I didn't need, and I started caring what other people thought of me. The hardest aspect was that I had given up on my education. It made me sick when I truly thought about it. It finally hit me. The money wasn't even mine to begin with. After all this time, I remembered the old lady and how she had won the lottery. After all, she was the reason I purchased the trip. I decided to find her because I had made up my mind. I remembered her address and prepared to see her. When I arrived at her house, it was little and worn out, yet it was also serene. When I knocked on the door, there she was. I explained what had happened with the tickets I had purchased and was prepared to apologize. But to my amazement, she said she couldn't remember. She noticed my bemusement and graciously invited me inside, and I saw her family there. She showed me around her children. She was the mother of 2 sons and 1 daughter. They also introduced me to their children. They all smiled as they greeted me, a total stranger, and they didn't seem bothered. I told them how I met their mother, and they all seemed to understand what had transpired. She had Alzheimer's disease, and it was becoming worse. Her children came home to aid their mother and brought their families to make her feel at ease, as their father had died a long time before. I came to thank her and split the money, but I didn't even offer them any money. They were gracious to me and invited me to dinner. I was hesitant, but I craved family dinners. So I made the decision to stay. It was one of the most enjoyable nights I'd had in a long time. We laughed together, told stories, and played games. The family wasn't wealthy, but they were content. It reminded me of something I used to own. So as the sun began to set and I began to depart, I turned and told her and her children about my plan to give them the majority of the money. I wrote checks for each of them and handed them out. They were stunned, then ecstatic. They were all laughing and smiling. I thanked the lady again and went away. I contacted my family and instructed them to meet me on my way home. They were already there when I arrived. When I walked in, I found them arguing again. I didn't want to waste any more time at that point. I calmed them down and went right into what I was doing. Their reactions ranged from stunned to enraged, but I didn't give up. I described how the money was affecting our lives. It was as if we were no longer a family. There was just enough for every one of us to live decently, and I could understand if they were mad with me. I walked away after that. It took a few days, but my family seemed to realize the same thing I did. My sister was the first to arrive, followed by my stepfather. My mother, on the other hand, hardly spoke to me after that. Her and my stepfather split, and she moved out on her own. Though I was saddened, I expected her to feel that way. After a while, it appeared that I was regaining custody of my family. Everyone had become accustomed to doing things their own way. But now we spend more time together as a family. I started college the way I always wanted to, by studying. I still have mixed feelings about the day I won the lotto and how it pitted my family against each other. But now I consider the good it was able to accomplish subsequently. I was able to assist a family that was not my own. How did I manage to return to school? And how I was able to recognize what actually mattered, which was family rather than money.